Hi there, Philip. This is a rebuttal to your opening statement. Before I go that, I just want to thank you for participating in this little experiment with me. I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am. It's really nice to have this kind of relaxed conversation here. Anyhow, a few things I want to talk about. I want to talk about SoCal. I want to talk about truth in science. I want to talk about scientific realism. I want to make some passing statements about postmodernism. And I want to answer the question, or at least address the question that you asked in your opening statement, to do with if there's a better way of approaching truth than empiricism, what is it? Okay, first off, to do with SoCal. The SoCal hoax, which I'm sure most people who are watching this video will know about. Alan Sokal, 1996, posted an article to Social Text, which was a journal in the Humanities at the time, and it was published, even though, as he admitted himself afterwards, it was entirely a hoax. He just cobbled together a whole bunch of sciencey sounding words, mixed them together with a bunch of vaguely postmodern / cultural studies kinds of words, and they got published. And it was a very successful hoax, and I think a really well pointed hoax. Brilliant piece of work. For me, it was effective because it pointed out some problems, not necessarily in the scholarship, which I'm going to come back to, but in the culture around that academic practice, or that culture around the scholarship, particularly to do with terrible reviewing processes, but also to do with the fact that it got a bit inward facing. There was far too much science envy going on. These people were clearly flattered when they got an article submitted by a scientist. So it just revealed some real cultural problems, sociological problems, if you like, in that particular area of scholarship. I don't think it really attacked the scholarship itself, and I think Sokal himself may have said something to that effect, although I can't find a reference to that. It was successful, and I loved it, and I still love it. However, I do think it cast a long and sometimes unfortunate shadow, and I think in some ways Peterson has been caught in that shadow, and I'd wanted to pull him out of it, give him his own light source for a bit. What I mean when I say that I think it's cast a long and sometimes unfortunate shadow is that, since then it's been very common, and it's almost popular, particularly on places like YouTube, to brand all scholarship in the humanities, in philosophy, in cultural theory, in media studies, in gender studies, in any of the social sciences, to cast all that as a kind of emperor's new clothes activity. It's all nonsense, it's all just a bunch of buzzwords, it's all impenetrable, it's just people making stuff up, it's not real scholarship. To kind of cast that whole thing in that light. And usually by referring back to Sokal, look, Sokal showed this 30 years ago, it's obviously nonsense. Is it 30 years ago? No, 20 years ago. Obviously nonsense. That's a bit of a shame, because I would want to argue for the value of scholarship in the humanities and the social sciences in those fields that I've talked about. My background is, to a certain extent, when I was an academic, was to do with scholarship in those areas, so I've got a case to argue there. But I think it's unfortunate that that shadow has been cast, and it's one you see perpetuated. I mean, obviously you see it in a really kind of low-grade scale on YouTube with endless pornage videos about silly feminist makes a video about feminist biology or something like that. Endless at that kind of crude level. But also, people who should know better. Dawkins made a really silly tweet about continental philosophy a couple of weeks ago, saying, "Oh, that's really silly. I imagine there'd be continental physics," demonstrating he doesn't know what continental philosophy is, but also, I think, just kind of reiterating an attitude towards philosophy and the social sciences and the humanities, which is they're not really worth doing. I think Stephen Hawking said something similar a few years back. I've heard Neil deGrasse Tyson say things which are kind of pointed in that direction. It's not real science, therefore it's not scholarship, therefore there's no truth, there's no knowledge, there's no facts, there's nothing in there, it's just made up BS. And if you haven't seen the Twitter feed for Real Peer Review, by the way, I would encourage people to look at that. Real Peer Review Twitter feed essentially picks up the abstracts of articles in journals from the humanities, the social sciences, those things I've mentioned, picks out those and holds them up for ridicule because they're dealing with trivial topics, or because they're using weird language, or because they're making a funny use of pronouns, or whatever it may be. Some of it justified, some perhaps not. But either way, all that stuff exists within this understanding that the humanities is no place for scholarship. It's not real scholarship at all. You won't find truth or knowledge in those areas. STEM is all there is. So I don't want to go down that route, and whilst I appreciate the SoCal reference, I'd rather kind of park that and look at Jordan Peterson in his own terms. Okay, second thing I want to pick up on is to do with truth in science. You say there's no truth in science, and I get where you're coming from completely. You provide the link to the Carlo Rovelli piece, No Certainty in Science. Got that, really interesting stuff. In preparation, I was also looking at this, which is Richard Feynman, collection of his writings. The meaning of it all, the first essay of which is called The Uncertainty of Science. So I get all that. Yeah, science is a set of methodologies for approximating truth, for devising statements or hypotheses that we can assign greater and greater levels of certainty to, that kind of thing. But you can never get to truth, and we would never do that because it doesn't use the right process. It's an inductive set of processes rather than deductive, or however you want to phrase it. You can't get to proof, you can't get to truth. Well, several problems with that, actually. I mean, I agree, technically you're correct, but to all intents and purposes, and for all practical purposes, can we not really get to truth in science? I mean, does not science not really proceed by acting as if the findings of the last 200, 300, 400 years have been true? If we didn't, on some level, accept that these statements are true, or at least true enough, I'm not quite sure what I mean by that even, but true, then we wouldn't proceed at all. So I think we do act as if these things are true, even if they don't reach some unattainable metaphysical level of truth, like a limit of some kind of process where absolute truth is ascertained. I think we're just setting the bar too high for ourselves there. We can't. If the logic of our procedures doesn't allow us to get to truth, then we have to just say that we're approximate, and we're forced to use words like approximate truth or movement towards truth. Then either truth is a metaphysics and we're out of science completely, or we're into philosophy, or we're saying we're true enough. We're acting as if this is true, and that's what we mean by truth. Truth is something, a statement that you act as if is true. And I think that's what science does. And in fact, Alan Sokal, who I talked about a minute ago, does happily use the word truth in science, as do other people. I was watching a Richard Dawkins video recently, one of his big think videos, therefore for a popular audience. Very happy to talk about truth in science. And I'm equally happy to do that. The other reason to talk about truth in science, and this is something of a side issue, is for not just pragmatic or practical reasons, but for political reasons. I'm sure you know about this. A few years ago, when theism was more of a thing, quite a lot of prominent theists would criticise science, particularly something like the science of evolution, by saying, no, that's not true, it's just a theory. Even the scientists say it's not true. They say it's just a theory, willfully misunderstanding the word theory, of course, but nevertheless correct in saying that the scientists don't say it's true, because you rightly point out, science doesn't produce truth. It's just a theory. And I think in response to that, some scientists have started saying, well, actually, no, it's true. It's certainly more true than the stuff that you believe in. And Jerry Coyne's blog, which is called Why Evolution is True, I think is symptomatic of that, a kind of political adopting of the idea that science does produce truths, because they're as true as you're going to get, certainly more true than something you'd find in Scripture. It is claimed. Certainly within the tenets of their paradigm that they're working with, the scientific realist paradigm. Okay, so I've talked about SoCal, I've talked about truth in science. I want to just delve a little bit into this scientific realism thing, really, because I need to set this up to contrast it with what I think Jordan Peterson is talking about and why he might be telling the truth. Scientific realism, there's a whole bunch of different kind of understandings. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is your go-to source here, basically articulates what I think how you work, and certainly Dawkins has expressed it in these terms, Sokal has, Harris certainly has, is a kind of philosophical approach to terms like truth, concepts like truth and knowledge and belief and evidence and maybe action. There's a set of these things all form kind of a constellation of ideas that together embody an epistemology. And broadly speaking, as you'll know yourself, we have this thing called belief. Belief should only be awarded to things that are true. That truth is justified by the pursuit of evidence, and in a scientific framework, evidence is a result of certain kinds of empirical processes. And so that kind of articulates how we should operate. But and as I say, Dawkins almost word for word spells it out like that. But that's not the only epistemology in town. That isn't the only way in which those terms, those concepts, relate to one another. Now, if I can give an example of that, and I have to say this isn't an example I fully believe in myself, but I kind of recognise it, which is to do with that relationship between knowledge, justification, truth, and belief. I've already explained how those relate in scientific realist terms, but there is another way of looking at it, and it hinges around this idea of justification. In scientific realism, justification acts to transform a truth into a belief by the use of empirical evidence, right? In other epistemologies, that justification for belief might be different. So, for example, there are claims that people who believe in God live longer, happier lives than poor old atheists like myself. Apparently the statistics bear that out. God botherers live longer, happier lives than atheists. Now that could be a justification for a belief in God based on outcomes, not based on evidence that supports the truth of it, or supports the truth of particular claims within it even, but based on outcomes. If I adopt a mindset which is believed in God, then I will live a longer, happier life. That's a justification for a belief. There's also some work done on free will, where I believe it's the case that people who believe in free will tend to make better moral choices. I'll have to search for the paper on that, but I'll give it a go. People who believe that they have free will make better moral choices than people who are less believing in that as a concept. Evidence for the existence of free will is really hard to find, maybe it doesn't exist at all, but if you believe in it, you make moral choices. So there's a good justification for believing in the existence of free will, even without the evidence. Again, you might not find those appealing at all. I'm interested in them, but don't find them entirely compelling either. But that's what I mean by a different epistemology. The way in which statements become justified, become part of a framework of knowledge, maybe even become true. I mean, I certainly believe in the truth of free will without any evidence at all, because I seem to live my life according to it being true, so I guess I have to believe it. That's a different epistemology at work there. And I think, although I'm not sure, I think Jordan Peterson is coming to this with a different epistemology, possibly not like the one I've just mentioned, but with a different epistemology that relates truth, knowledge, evidence, facts, outcomes, all those things in different ways. I think he's also coming at this from a kind of meta perspective. I think he recognises that scientific realism is one epistemology amongst many, and in fact there are many versions of scientific realism. So when he frames Harris's discussion of truth as nested within larger truths, perhaps, and other statements which react as if are true, I think it's also in that way he's talking about it, that yes, scientific epistemology, scientific realism is very, very effective as an epistemology for producing technology and so on, curing diseases, aeroplanes, you name it. It is still an epistemology, regardless of its success or failure. It is still like that, and truth exists within that. Facts about data, for example, exists within that, for sure, but only within the context of that highly successful epistemology, and in a sense a kind of trivial truths against the larger framework of other epistemologies, including the one perhaps he holds, which gives greater prominence to things like myths and the Darwinian framework, as I mentioned in my opening statement. Okay, I've warmed on long enough. I hope that makes some kind of sense. Talked about SoCal, talked about truth in science, talked about scientific realism, trying to get to Peterson's epistemology itself. That'll do. Thank you very much for participating. I look forward to hearing. I've gone on so long. This is supposed to be 5 minutes. I do apologise. Get talking. What can I tell you? See you now.